the whole gender assigned at birth is this insane notion that the doctors are assigning like a social role to an infant at birth, and then they'll point to the intersex individuals as this example that there's this sort of blurry line between males and females. And since we can't really draw this definitive line perfectly between males and females, that there is some blur, therefore it's arbitrary. This wasn't just people being wrong about biology, but there was sort of ideological motivation. So I realized that I wasn't going to convince them just by talking about gametes and how the sexes are defined. It's much more pernicious than that.
Thank you for meeting with us and doing this interview. I definitely appreciate it. If we could start with your name and what you currently do for a living, that'd be great.
Yeah, my name is Colin Wright. I'm an evolutionary biologist. Currently, I run a Substack, Reality's Last Stand, and I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute.
Did you have a specialty in biology? Like, what did you study?
So I was an evolutionary behavioral ecologist, which means I just studied the fitness consequences of behavior, and specifically I studied collective personalities in social insect and arachnid societies.
Interesting. Personalities in insects. I wouldn't have even imagined that was a field of study. How's that defined in what you do?
So it's defined similar to the way you define personality in humans. So it's consistent inter-individual differences in behavior that's persistent across time and different contexts. So if you have one organism that's aggressive in one time, it's more likely to be aggressive in other contexts and things like that. So just like individuals have differences in personality, there's also personality that can emerge at the group level. And so I would look at sort of the behavioral composition of entire colonies of insects and arachnids, and then I could modify the behavioral composition and seeing how that translates into sort of collective differences in just how the entire colony operates.
Interesting. Yeah, is it analogous to human beings? Like, can you use what you've learned there to map anything onto group behavior and socialization in human beings?
Yeah, it's not like a one-to-one. Like you can't, since you're studying species that are so, distantly related, but you can kind of see glimmers of what's going on in humans, or at least, some things I've seen in spiders and insects, such as like this type of mobbing behavior. It's definitely what I've experienced on Twitter kind of reminds me of a lot of that stuff going on.
Right. Twitter is just a big cesspool with a bunch of insects biting each other.
Yeah, pretty much.
So what got you interested in talking about gender ideology and the trans movement?
It was initially just people who I thought were being wrong about biology. So I have a history of debunking a lot of pseudoscience in the field of biology. So I started off wanting to get into evolutionary biology because I found myself in debates with the sort of young Earth creationists and intelligent design proponents back in sort of the late 2000s, early 2010s. And it really kind of gripped me because something like evolutionary biology, this is just a fundamental aspect of not just humans, but all of life, every organism. And if you're denying a fundamental aspect of your biology, it's going to have negative consequences. It's useful in medicine. We just had a pandemic and you need to track variants. So evolutionary biology is like extraordinarily relevant. And then, so I was arguing against that. And then that sort of fell out of the limelight. There wasn't so much discussion of it anymore. I also just started going to grad school. So I was focused on just doing my academic papers. And then I saw a lot of my colleagues starting to say interesting things about the biology of sex. They were saying things like, there's 5 sexes, or that sex is a spectrum, or that maybe even sex is just a social construct completely, and there's no such thing as males and females. There's just sort of degrees of maleness and femaleness, and we all can be plotted on this spectrum, and no one's one or the other type of thing. And then I saw the arguments they were using were just looking at things like secondary sexual characteristics, like breasts in females, or facial hair, body hair, things that are certainly related to your sex, but aren't what defines an individual's sex. And so I just wanted to have the academic conversation. That's why I became a scientist in the first place, just so I could have these discussions about biology, thinking I was going to be met with the same, what you would expect among academics. They would you'd give your evidence and reason, and if they disagreed, they would present their evidence and reason. And instead, I just sort of got the whole, you're a transphobe, you're a sexist, they would even throw a white supremacist in the mix. Just anything besides actually addressing the problems I was raising that were strictly biological at the time. And it was only after I saw this crazy pushback that it was just sort of a different kind of argument and critique they were giving on me. that I wasn't used to, that I decided to kind of look under the hood and realize this wasn't just people being wrong about biology, but there was sort of ideological motivation behind it. It was very ideological. It was in the works for a long time. It was rooted in sort of these postmodern queer theories. So I realized that I wasn't going to convince them just by talking about gametes and how the sexes are defined. This is much more pernicious than that.
Right. It's interesting. I feel like queer theory intentionally, I think they even say this in their work, that they intentionally try to blur boundaries. And, I've read some of Judith Butler, which is a real pain in the ass. But, she talks about biology or biological sex being a social construct. And yet many people on the left will say, well, no one actually believes that. No one actually believes that biology or biological sex is not real or is a social construct. Is that true?
That is not true. So I still get that today from people saying that I'm just misinterpreting them. They're actually talking about gender being a spectrum, not sex. But then when you just push them a little bit more, you'll get them to admit things like, well, sex and gender, they're completely intertwined, they're inseparable. Or they'll just say both sex and gender are a spectrum. They'll point to intersex conditions in humans to say, just because we can find some humans that are somewhat ambiguous in their sexual presentation, therefore we can sort of extend that blur to the entire picture, and you just get degrees of maleness and females from there. And also, if they weren't denying the reality of biological sex, we wouldn't get things like people who are unambiguously male, like Leah Thomas, competing in female sports. If this was just people's gender presentation, the way they're expressing themselves, if that was the only spectrum they're talking about, well, that doesn't get you males in female sports, that doesn't get you males in female prisons. I think they retreat to the whole gender as a spectrum thing is because that's an easier thing to defend. But what we see in practical terms is a denial of biological sex.
So do you think that's a classic example of the Mott and Bailey technique, where they put out these more extreme positions and then retreat to, it's all so confusing, where they interchange sex and gender, but then they say, well, gender is totally different. Gender identity is totally separate from sex. That's why you can be born in the wrong body. It's so confusing. So I'm wondering, a lot of people have different definitions of gender. Do you think gender is a legitimate concept? And if so, what do you think it is?
Yeah, I think there are some definitions that I can sort of get behind. I don't have like my own definition of gender. I usually ask people what they mean when they use the word, because I don't like getting in like the debates about just what's the true definition of a term. I care about the concept they're trying to convey, and then I also try to make sure that they're not using it interchangeably with sex, because I want to maintain that sort of that wall between how people identify and what people are at a biological level. I think one the way that I think is a useful way to define gender, it's sort of what I hear a lot of some feminists discuss, and it's sort of the social expectations that are put on individuals on the basis of their sex. This is the way we whip people into performing certain stereotypes. I've certainly seen this type of bullying before when you have kids, both male or female, who aren't just maximally masculine or feminine. There is sort of this masculine policing, there's femininity policing. So I think there's something there. If we want to call that gender, I can understand that. I think it's an interesting sort of social force to think about, and how norms are sort of enforced at a social level. But ultimately, I'll take whatever definition people want of gender, as long as they're not treading into my territory and saying that gender is sex and they're both social constructs, and they just sort of blur those lines completely, which tends to be the most common thing that I see.
Right. Yeah, I liked Dr. Deborah So's definition, which was, it's really just gender is how someone thinks about their sex, and even that is more or less biologically determined. I'm curious I think that was her definition. I'm curious what you think of that conception of it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what people are going off of now when people say that they have a gender identity that's a male or masculine. I think this is more of a self-reflection about their own self-perceived degree of masculinity or femininity that's based on the norms that they see, the average male and the average female. And so most people have a good idea of how masculine or feminine they are in comparison to their colleagues and the population at large. And so you can kind of place yourself on a spectrum of, I'm not completely Dwayne The Rock Johnson, I'm not a complete, Barbie type individual. Everyone sort of falls in between those two extremes, some more than others. So I think that's what most people sort of mean when they talk about gender, and I think that's maybe what Deborah was getting at.
Yeah, except in her definition, it seemed to be determined at birth or in utero, rather than
Yeah.
being a socially imposed presentation.
Again, there's a lot of conflation that they have. You'll get people that will talk about your gender that's assigned at birth. Then they'll also talk about your sex that's assigned at birth, and depending on the context, they'll either be the same thing or they'll be different things. The whole gender assigned at birth is this insane notion that the doctors are assigning like a social role to an infant at birth. And you can even see on the website for Planned Parenthood when they talk about what does it mean, why do we say assigned sex or some things like that. And they say it's because someone's making a decision on behalf of someone that might not fit how they feel about themselves. But I just think it's completely insane, this idea that doctors are assigning roles, like this is going to be a masculine child, like some Godfather type scene where they're just trying to give these individuals, if it's a girl, they're not saying it's a male or a female, they're saying this is going to be a masculine child, this is a feminine child. That's just not what doctors are doing. They're just observing the sex and they're recording that. Yeah, so that's sort of one example of how they conflate sort of assigned sex and assigned gender across the board, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it seems to me a more appropriate phrase would be registered not even at birth, registered in the ultrasound or something, right?
Yeah, your sex observed at birth. That's, I think. And, there are instances where doctors will get it wrong, usually not in the US because we do a lot of sort of screening for chromosomes and things like that beforehand. But there are some intersex conditions where they might present as female at birth and they can be given the wrong sort of sex designation. And it's not even till later on when they should be going through puberty and they don't get their periods and why? Turns out they have internal testes. So sometimes these things are revealed. But then a lot of the activists will pretend that just because a doctor might get it wrong 1 out of 10,000 times or something, therefore we all need to be in this sort of superposition of we're not quite sure what our sex is at any given moment, and this can change. So this is, there's always that use of the exception to try to disprove the rule that's extremely robust.
Yeah, it's almost Schrodinger's sex, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's get into DSDs. Can you explain what a DSD is, and then also maybe talk about why, if you know, why trans people or the trans movement like to use those disorders as examples or proof that people can be trans?
Yeah, so DSD is a very broad term. It's just differences of sexual development. This can include things like a condition called hypospadias, which means it's when the penis is being formed in utero. Sometimes the urethra won't form at the very tip. It might just be just under the head, or it can be further down the shaft. These individuals aren't sexually ambiguous at all. They just have a sort of difference, and sometimes this can be fixed very easily with a minor surgery. But that's not to be confused with intersex conditions. So all intersex conditions are DSDs, but not all DSDs are intersex conditions. To be intersex, it really have to have a degree of sexual ambiguity, at least of appearance at birth, or this sort of mismatch between how you appear and what your internal organs are. So I call what a lot of the gender activists do with intersex conditions, because usually all the arguments about, let's take males competing in female sports, for instance, because they identify as women. When you just start interrogating why that's okay, they'll give an argument that sex is a spectrum. And then they'll point to the intersex individuals as this example that there's this sort of blurry line between males and females because, and since we can't really draw this definitive line, perfectly between males and females, that there is some blur, therefore it's arbitrary, therefore there's really no one's to say whose line is better than the next, and so we should just give up trying to draw lines completely and let people just self-identify into these categories. I call this the intersex trap because they're using these intersex conditions, these very rare conditions, in order to argue that people without these conditions can just identify totally across this boundary that might have just the tiniest bit of blur when you really, really zoom in. So people like Leah Thomas, this isn't someone who's intersex. This is someone who's unambiguously male, who's one side of the entire coin. If it's like a heads or tails option, it's just identifying as the other half. It's not like the coin landed on its edge and we're just trying to decide what side to put them on. So it really is just a complete fallacy to suggest that just because some people are ambiguous, therefore we're all ambiguous to some degree, which is to say it's arbitrary and we can just, there's no way you can possibly tell somebody that they're not the sex they claim they are. That's just completely false.
Right. Yeah, so Helen's obviously not a scientist, but the way she was explaining it a couple days ago to me was in terms of DSDs and intersex and all of this was something like that. It's generally more or less clear, or maybe not clear is the right word, but there are males and females, and they just have developmental problems, just like an eyeball may be malformed at birth, or something might not develop properly with any part of the body. She was essentially saying that that's true with sex organs. Is that accurate or inaccurate? Is it more ambiguous than that sometimes?
I think sometimes it could be. The vast majority of people with intersex conditions, it's like a sex-specific intersex condition, where they might be sexually ambiguous in appearance at birth, but you can just do a few more tests and you can find out, oh, they have internal testes, their internal male organs that just didn't drop for whatever variety of reason. I think it's probably important to just maintain some openness that someone could have a completely bizarre condition where they present truly ambiguous, and we shouldn't necessarily try to make sure that everybody can just be shoved into one of these two boxes called male and female. But just because someone might be sexually ambiguous in their presentation, this doesn't mean, one, that male and female are these arbitrary social constructs. And it doesn't mean there's anything like more than two sexes. Someone being sexually ambiguous, that's not a third sex, that's just sexual ambiguity. Just as the common garden snail that's a simultaneous hermaphrodite, they're both male and female, that's still not a third sex, it's just having both of those sexes housed in one body. In a similar way, if you are neither sex, or if you're an ambiguous sex, this isn't a third sex. This is like a different way a body can be, I guess, formed, but it's definitely not similar to having your sex organs organized around producing sperm or ova. Since there's no intermediate sort of gamete that can be produced, there's not a third sex a human can be.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, it's good to not be too rigid in our thinking. I think that's appropriate. So another argument I find interesting about biology and sex is that, trans activists will point to like the way alligators' eggs develop, or I think it was alligators or crocodiles, I don't know, but or like how clownfish can change sex. Why does that, it seems just like a pretty silly question, but why does that not apply to human beings?
Yeah, there's all kinds of different ways that organisms can determine their sex. Some can change their sex in their lifetimes. We get these constantly thrown at us in an attempt to make some kind of statement about humans, when it's just perfectly natural, or what we should be saying rather is humans are not clownfish, humans are not reptiles. There's no examples of humans spontaneously changing their sex. Specifically with regard to reptiles, there's this claim that sex, there's all kinds of different ways to determine one's sex. And this is actually an important point, because a lot of people, and even biologists that I know, they'll conflate how sex is determined with how sex is defined. So when biologists talk about sex being determined, or sex determination mechanisms, we're actually talking about like sort of the mechanisms that begin a developmental process that results in the creation, the development of a male or a female. But no matter how that's, male or females are mechanistically determined and develop, they're still defined the same way, which is by the type of their primary reproductive anatomy and what it's designed around, the type of gamete it's designed around to produce. So we know that, for instance, with alligators and a lot of other reptiles, they have what's called temperature-dependent sex determination, where their sex is determined by the temperature at which their eggs are incubated. And in humans, we have chromosomal sex determination. This doesn't mean that I can look at someone's chromosomes and that defines their sex. It just means it determines it, just like temperature determines it in some reptiles. But the only way that we know that humans use chromosomes to determine their sex and that reptiles use temperature is because we know that sex is not the same thing as chromosomes or temperature. We know what males and females are first, And if we didn't know what they were first beforehand, we wouldn't be able to even make that correlation between, oh, look, males are associated with Y chromosomes, and male alligators are associated with higher incubation temperatures. So it's important not to confuse how sex is determined with how sex is defined, because it's defined the same way across all species, even though many different species have different ways that they developmentally determine an individual's sex.
Sure. Is it true that, so I don't know about clownfish, can they change sex like at any point, or is it only when they're young, or how does that work?
It's determined by sort of a dominance hierarchy they have. So you have the sea anemone, and it's usually dominated by a single dominant female. And then beneath the anemone, there's sort of this dominance hierarchy of different males, and they form this order. And so if the female were to die, the male, who's the runner-up, takes over the anemone and becomes, starts turning into a female. So it's unidirectional. You can't turn back into a male once you've turned into a female. And then, the next male in line sort of awaits their turn to hopefully take over this anemone. So yeah, it's an interesting developmental process. But again, the way we know that the males are turning into females is because they turn from an individual that's producing sperm to an individual that's producing eggs. So which is the universal, defining property of males and females.
Right. I've also heard people talk about the idea that a trans person's brain is just more similar to the opposite sex, and people think that there's strong evidence for that. Is there evidence for the wrong brain theory?
No, that's just not how brains work. It's not how we develop. I mean, any organ that humans have, any feature that we have, can be varying degrees of masculinized or feminized. So you can look at people's hands. There's ways you can see when, if we're exposed to a lot of testosterone, I think it's the second or third digit can be longer relative to the other, relative to your other fingers. Individuals who are exposed in utero to this higher levels of testosterone have this, you can measure their digits and get an estimate of how much testosterone was there. But we wouldn't say that sort of a female who has a very masculine-looking hand, was born with the wrong hands. You have a female whose hands are still female, no matter how they look. And this is kind of the same way with brains. You can have brains that are more masculinized, that are more feminized, just like any other part of your body. Some people's faces look, more masculine, more feminine. You can mistake someone's sex by looking at their facial features. But it's not to say that you can literally be born with the brain of an opposite sex in your body. And the literature on this is actually, they're just rediscovering what we found in terms of discovering the neurological basis of homosexuality to some degree, because we've known for a long time that when you take a bunch of brain scans of people who are same-sex attracted, that they tend to have brains that are skewed more towards the opposite sex, it looks like. They tend to, males tend to have more feminized brains, lesbians tend to have more masculinized looking brains. All the studies where they try to link this to gender identity, they don't control for homosexuality because it's very tightly linked. The people who are more likely to be trans are overwhelmingly same-sex attracted. And all the studies where they actually control for sexuality, they don't find any relationship whatsoever for gender identity in the brain. So really they're just recapitulating these old studies about the fact that we're picking up same-sex attraction in people's brains.
Right. Is there any biological basis for gender identity at all?
To date, we have not discovered any biological basis of gender identity.
Do you think we ever will, or?
I don't think so, because I think, again, I think we're just picking up on people's sort of degree of self-assessed masculinity or femininity. So to the degree that that's what we're picking up, I think that's something that can be detected in the brain. If you scan enough brains, you might find a significant correlation. But in terms of just gender identity, it's defined in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes, people, the social role that they most identify with. To any degree there's a correlation there, it's just picking up on same-sex attraction, sexuality, because that is very correlated with people having gender nonconforming behavior, and therefore a gender nonconforming identity as well.
Sure. On trigonometry, you talked about brain scans for gender dysphoria. Can you talk about that and what has been discovered, if anything significant?
I think it's just similar to what I just said. You scan the brains of people who are gender dysphoric. A common trait that you have of people who are homosexual and their kids, they have a type of gender dysphoria that's really just this recognition that their behavior is different from members of their same sex. They tend to feel alienated because the boys tends to, maybe they play with dolls, they like to hang out with the girls more, and vice versa for a girl who's gonna maybe grow up to be a lesbian. They're just very gender nonconforming. They can feel ostracized, and I think a lot of it now, that's being considered a type of gender dysphoria because they have this social anxiety about their sex because they don't feel like they fit in. So I think this is being confused with sort of the old school gender dysphoria, which is like that the hatred of your genitals, the strong desire to want to be the opposite sex. I think we're picking up more on that now, and we're confusing just general anxiety of not fitting in with members of your same sex with gender dysphoria, and I think those need to be sort of made distinct.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think that that's true for all the kids, that there aren't necessarily any kids who have this hatred towards their genitals, or and it's really more just a social phenomenon and manifesting through anxiety and distress and autism and that sort of thing?
I think that's probably the vast majority of what we're seeing now. There's been these diagrams that have been used by these trans charities like Mermaids in the UK, where they literally will have, what is your gender identity? And they'll have a G.I. Joe on one side and a Barbie on the other side. And then they'll have sort of the sex spectrum below that. And the idea is that you pick out where along that spectrum of masculinity and femininity that you reside. And then, how your body looks on the sort of sex spectrum that they try to portray. And then this idea that if your identity in the way that your body looks aren't completely aligned on those two spectrums, that's somehow an issue. There is some misalignment, and then we can bring sort of those two traits closer to one another through hormones and surgeries and things like that. Whereas I would just say that, yeah, people can be any varying degree of masculine or feminine. Their bodies can be any varying degree of masculinized or feminized. There's nothing wrong with you. There's no mismatch that's inherent in that. That's just the natural variation that you would expect to see in biology. This is one of Darwin's first principles of biology, and it goes for behavior, it goes for body shape, it goes for everything that we see that has any sort of genetic or environmental component as well. The point is not to just try to pigeonhole people, saying that you're male, you need to be masculine, you're female, you need to be feminine. If you're not, then there's something wrong with you. I thought this is sort of like the old school sexism that I thought we were sort of moving past, and that was what liberalism was all about. And now it seems like this ideology, the gender ideology, is sort of fusing those social roles back together. They're just sort of removing sex out of the equation, where they say that you're a man regardless of your sex, as long as you're performing these masculine stereotypes. That's what a male is. There's a meme that I thought really encapsulated gender ideology, and I think it was this 3-part meme, and it said, historically there was sexism, and sexism said that women have to do the dishes. And then the second line was equality, which states that both men and women can do the dishes. And then it said gender ideology, and it was whoever's doing the dishes is the woman. And I think that's just like a really good encapsulation of sort of what gender identity has done to sort of solidify these old sexist social roles. It just says that, you're a man based on your affinity to masculine stereotypes regardless of your sex, and opposite for being a woman.
Right, yeah, it seems very regressive. Yeah, so I want to talk more generally about the kind of the hard sciences and just how things have creeped in there. How, this kind of woke ideology, it's usually said that it'll just sort of stay in the humanities and the soft sciences and in these academic fields where people theorize all day. But is that true, or has it made its way into engineering and biology and these other things through the trans movement in particular?
It's definitely made massive inroads in my field of evolutionary biology and ecology.